Okay, if you look at the schedule for the course, you may have already noticed that we've got another quiz coming up. So quiz 3 will be on Monday. And the intended coverage there is just to kind of capture and assess what we've done since the last time you had either an exam or a quiz. And so it'll be the more recent material. Homework 8 is due a week from today, and I'll post that online immediately after class. It's related to these water pollution material that we're doing and biochemical oxygen demand, and so that'll be available this afternoon, due next week. And then the wastewater treatment plant tour, it seemed far off when I first announced it, but now here March is just right around the corner. So just keep in mind that you need to block out your schedule for the 12th because we're going to go to the wastewater treatment plant. Does anybody have any questions? All right. If we think about the total amount of water that exists in the whole world, and we said 100% of that water equals 100 liters, just to kind of put the relative quantities of different categories of water into perspective. So all of the world, if you were just going to scale it down and say that all the water in the world is 100 liters, then only 3 of those 100 liters are fresh water. The other 97% of the water in the world is salt water. And for obvious reasons, it's more difficult for us to use salt water than fresh water. We can't drink salt water. Salt water is ill-suited for industrial purposes, for agriculture. And so it's only the fresh water that is of the most use to us. We can use salt water if we expend a bunch of energy to desalinate it, but it's 100 times more expensive to generate desalinated water than it is to go through the process of purifying water that's already fresh. So 3% of the Earth's water is fresh, but most of that fresh water isn't available to us because it's either in the wrong place or it's the wrong temperature. So what I mean by that is a lot of the fresh water in the world is at the North or South Pole, and there's no people effectively living there. And people have had various suggestions over the years that maybe like they could tow an iceberg to a city and then use that as drinking water, but it's never been done. It's not especially practical. Also, the fresh water that is really deep underground, so deep that it wouldn't be feasible to pump it up. That's also fresh water, but it's not usable. And so now if we talk about 100% of the Earth's water, only 0.5% of it is available, but an even smaller of that is usable. And the difference between available and usable is that we have to leave some water in the environment for the species that live in rivers, for example. So we couldn't pump out all of the water out of the Ohio River and use it for agriculture because then it wouldn't be navigable for the barges that go up and down the river. Then it wouldn't be able to support the fish species anymore. And so in some places you can use a lot of a river's water, other places you can't. And so 0.003% of the overall Earth's water supply is usable. So I bring this up just to make the point that water is precious, and so we have to look for ways to keep it pure so that we can use it for the intended use. And then also we need to understand the things that pollute the water and degrade its usability to us. Now, water takes on the characteristics of the environment that it's in. And so you probably wouldn't want to drink water that was running off the surface of an industrial facility where they're making chemicals. So, like Marathon Petroleum's down the road, and I'm sure that they do their best when it comes to environmental compliance, but I wouldn't want to lay at the end of the gutter with my mouth open on a rainy day and just drink the runoff water that's coming from, their plant facility, because it's probably got some gasoline in it, some oil, other solvents. Just the water takes on the characteristics of the environment that it's in. And so the hydrologic cycle is the movement of water through the environment, which is driven by the sun, which evaporates water from the sea or from lakes. Rain falls onto the ground surface. Some of it flows over the surface, and it'll pick up the bacteria that are at the surface. It'll pick up maybe color, turbidity, organic material from decaying organic matter like leaves and grass clippings and so on. Some of it will percolate down into the subsurface, and the water there takes on the characteristics of the subsurface. So the subsurface doesn't have a lot of oxygen, so therefore the dissolved oxygen is low in groundwater. The subsurface has a lot of mineral content, so groundwater has a lot of mineral content. So the place that we get our water from is going to influence the quality of the water. And here's just a diagram that's showing, like, schematically a home that has well water, and you're tapping into an aquifer, which in different places may be shale, other places it could be limestone, could be clay, and as that water fluctuates up and down in the level of the well casing, it's still going to be taking on the characteristics of the aquifer because the water is coming towards the well casing in all directions radially, and so as the water's filtering through the pores of the soil, it's taking on those mineral characteristics. And so our book has a table that kind of compares and contrasts different characteristics of water. And the big categories are groundwater, meaning water from the subsurface taken from aquifers, and surface water. So groundwater, its composition is relatively constant over time. It's not like you're going to have one day high hardness, the next day low hardness. The temperature is about constant underground. The chemical characteristics are pretty constant underground. But at the surface, there's a lot of changes seasonally, and there's also changes. Maybe if you have a big rainstorm, then that could change the turbidity compared to a dry spell. And so this table just kind of is showing the differences between ground and surface water in terms of mineralization, turbidity, color, whether there are pathogens that we need to be aware of. Now, with groundwater, it depends on how deep the well is, because sometimes there could be groundwater that is not safe. There's a former faculty member at Marshall who has a farm up in Jackson County, and he's got a shallow well for his farm. And you can't drink the water. It's okay to use it for washing, for hosing down, irrigating, but because the well is shallow, if there are any bacteria at the surface, they could get down into his well water. And so groundwater is bacteriologically safe as long as the well's deep enough, whereas the surface water has pathogenic microorganisms in almost every case. Saltwater intrusion is a unique issue that affects coastal areas and, oddly, some inland areas where they have concentrated salinity. And the way it basically works is that when you have the ocean next to ground, that the saline water from the ocean penetrates beneath the sea floor. And so just like how we have aquifers underground, under land, there's also water in the soil beneath the ocean. And the water that's beneath the ocean has high salt content. And that salt content can penetrate underneath the ground. If we extract the fresh water, then the salt water can intrude into fresh groundwater aquifers. And so by extracting out the fresh water on the left-hand side of this figure, then that causes the salt water to migrate. So we just have to be aware of the potential for saltwater intrusion. And there are some inland areas in the southwest part of the United States, and like New Mexico and Utah, where there were, in years past, really large inland salty seas that there's still high salt deposits underground, and then sometimes the saline brackish water can move around because of extracting the fresh water for irrigation and for public utility purposes. So saltwater intrusion is something that I think is very interesting, and it's a big issue, particularly in places like California, where they have a lot of agriculture in California, and they also happen to be close to the sea. So we're talking in this chapter about water pollution. And if the question is how clean does the water need to be, then the next question should be what are we going to use the water for? Because maybe you have a different standard for water that you're going to use to irrigate. So if you're putting it on crops, for example, it may not matter as much if there's a little bit of turbidity in it. If it's going on to crops, it may not matter if there's an adenovirus that causes a cold in humans. Irrigating it on crops that are months and months away from being harvested, it's probably not going to be an issue. So if you're going to drink the water, though, maybe the standards are a little bit different. And then if it's water that's being directly injected into the human veins, so IV fluid would have an altogether different standard of purity and a different answer of how clean is clean enough. And so the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, looks at the intended use of the water, and then the standard that the water has to be at, the purity standard, reflects the intended use of the source. So water quality is a relative term, and water that you're using for irrigation or for washing machines or for drinking water, those all have different standards. And probably the standard we care the most about in this course would be the drinking water standards, because that's what every community has to somehow find for people is drinking water. Like surgical use water can be brought in limited quantities on a truck. You know, a municipality isn't going to have to generate its own IV water. And water for an industrial plant, most likely that industrial plant itself would have its own permit and its own treatment plant if it's going to be taking water out of the river, for example, to use for industrial cooling. So a municipality wouldn't necessarily have to be involved in that. The categories of contamination that we care about would be like chemical constituents, including both inorganic and organic materials, including things like nutrients, biochemical oxygen demand. There can be physical constituents, which are considered contamination, like suspended solids and sediment, and then pathogens, which could be bacteria, viruses, protozoa. So we're going to talk about each of those, and we can break these different types of pollutants into either point sources or non-point sources. And non-point sources would mean like a distributed runoff from a field. I've got a diagram here in a minute to illustrate the difference between point and non-point. But like an industrial waste, if it's going into a river, usually would come from a single pipe. Like they're kind of intentionally gathering together the industrial waste, hopefully treating it, and then discharging it into the river at a single point. So we see different types of chemicals in different categories of delivery into a stream. So think about here in West Virginia, what are some likely sources of pollution in this area? Any thoughts about the Ohio River and what you've heard about the Ohio River and the bad things that get into it?
Runoff from industrial plants.
Okay, runoff from industrial plants. That's good. What else?
Sewage, trash.
Sewage, okay. Yeah, if we think about, here we are in Huntington, who's upstream of us? Gallipolis, Point Pleasant, they're discharging into the Ohio River.
That are people.
Pardon me?
That are people with their own sewage.
Yeah, that there could be septic tanks, you know, like if you're living in a rural area, you may not discharge to like a municipal treatment plant. And a lot of septic tanks are broken, failing, just discharging more or less raw waste into a stream. There's also, anytime there's construction, if you are like scraping the earth, you know, you got a bulldozer out, you're scraping the earth, then you've got exposed soil that is very sensitive to, if rain falls on it, then the rain can carry the sediment downstream, and so that's another source of pollution is construction activities. Think about what they do to the roads when it's icy out. They put salt down on the roads. That salt is a pollutant. It makes, if the salinity gets too high, then it interferes with plants and fish. One of the unique pollutants that we have in this area comes from the mining activities. And in the past there was coal mining as I guess there's still coal mining. There's just less of it now than there used to be. As a water pollutant, what the issue with coal mining was acid mine drainage. It's just, when you dig down into the ground and you bring things out, you could have heavy metals. And one of the things that is very closely associated with coal mining is called acid mine drainage. It's just that the water that comes from underground has a low pH, and when it has a low pH, it generally dissolves metals more easily. And so that's an issue that's unique to West Virginia, is acid mine drainage. And then when you've got low pH water, kind of the heavy metals, it tends to dissolve. Another issue, though, is that with hydraulic fracture, which is used for extracting gas from underground, they're going so deep that they are, in a lot of cases, liberating nuclear material, like low concentrations of things like radium. I'm not talking about uranium or plutonium, but there are other elements that are radioactive, and they're really hard to remove from water. And so there's been a big uptick of radium getting into the Ohio River from hydraulic fracture. So things for us to be aware of. So point sources of waste are when you've got a river and a discharge is concentrated at a single location. So that could be a pipe coming in to deliver domestic wastewater or industrial discharges. It could be where two rivers come together and one of them is heavily polluted. That can be considered a point source. Or if you've got a lot of animals in a concentrated location. But then non-point sources are distributed over a wider area. So that could be like the salt being applied to a road. And it's over a really long length. Or it could be disturbed soil because maybe a farmer has just tilled the land and the soil's all disturbed, and now it's raining hard and taking some of that sediment downstream. That would be considered a non-point source. So it's important for us to be able to distinguish point from non-point sources, because we do different things to control them. You have to use a completely different strategy to control non-point sources of pollution than point sources of pollution. In fact, it's a little bit easier to control point sources of pollution because it comes into the river at a single location. And the problem is often more spread out, and it's a lot of different people contributing to the problem in a non-point source. And so you can't just regulate one person like you can for a point source. You may have multiple stakeholders that have to all kind of be accommodated. So an animal feedlot, where you've got a bunch of cattle all together, can discharge a lot of pathogens to a river, where a non-point source maybe would be a farmland that is all being having either pesticides or fertilizer, both of which have a negative impact on the quality of water when the water gets back into streams and rivers. The physical characteristics of water include turbidity, which we've talked extensively about, color, taste, and odor, but now temperature is also a potential pollutant. And the reason why temperature is a pollutant is that if water is warmed, then the amount of dissolved oxygen that can exist in water that's warm is lower. And we know that fish get their oxygen from the water. Fish don't breathe air like we do. They just extract dissolved oxygen from the water. And so if the water's too warm, then there isn't enough dissolved oxygen in the water for the fish, and they can become stressed. And so there are a lot of cases where, for example, dams have changed the temperature of water in a negative way for the rivers downstream, and also power plants and industrial facilities that discharge heat as a pollutant to rivers can have an impact on the ecology downstream. If we look at the chemical characteristics of things that get into the water, there are some inorganic materials, meaning they don't have any carbon, that some of them are relatively harmless. Iron and manganese cause staining and precipitation, but they're not toxic to humans. But then there are some inorganic materials that can be harmful, and depending on the dose, it can be extremely harmful. So, for example, lead is not safe at any concentration. Mercury, not safe at any concentration. So a lot of these heavy metals aren't safe at any concentration. But then there are other things like sodium, fluoride, and sulfates where a little it isn't harmful. And in fact, a little is helpful in the case of fluoride because of the benefits it has for preventing dental caries, as we talked about last time. So our book has this table of what is the federal standard for different type of inorganic constituents. And it tells us, for example, arsenic, the federal standard goal is to bring the concentration down to 0, but the maximum limit is 0.01 milligrams per liter. This table also has the best available technology to help you achieve that standard if the water is polluted. So it may be like oxidation. It could be things like reverse osmosis. And then it talks about the potential health effects of each of these different pollutants. And so I think it would be good for you to read through this list of pollutants. It's some chemicals maybe that you're already aware of, some that you maybe haven't heard of before. And there's also the effect of organic materials. Organic meaning compounds that have carbon. And so organic materials could have acute effects, and acute means short term. It means that even just being exposed to it one time could cause an immediate effect. So 50 milligrams of nicotine, this chemical C10H14N2, that's nicotine that you get from vape pods or tobacco. 50 milligrams per kilogram is the LD50 dose. LD50 means if they do a population study, they oftentimes, to assess how dangerous certain chemicals are, they define how much of it would kill 50% of the population. So they call that the LD50, the lethal dose that would kill 50% of a population. So for us, humans, if all of us in here had 50 milligrams of nicotine per kilogram of body mass, then half of us would die within 30 minutes. So that's an example of a chemical that has an acute response. There are also some chemicals that have a chronic effect over and above their acute exposure issues. Go ahead.
For the exposed population, is that like exposed adults, or is that include like babies and older people?
Well, they usually do studies on mice and extrapolate to humans. So, I mean, it's a fuzzy science. I don't think that they actually test these on people, so to speak, you know. But I think it's generally meant to assess like the effect in adults.
Okay, yeah, that's something I was like, where did they get that?
Because certain populations are even more vulnerable than an average adult. So like, you know, somebody with a bad kidney and other comorbidities would maybe be even more sensitive than this. But I think it's just talking about the healthy adult. Great question. So acute means short term, chronic means long term. And just as an illustration of a chemical which has chronic effect, bromodichloromethane. If you drink 2.3 liters of water per day, which is their assumption for the average daily intake, and their assumption for a lifetime exposure is 70 years. The EPA has done these studies to just say they want to reduce the incidence of carcinogenic chemicals in water. And they're trying to make it so that no chemicals are in water that cause cancer more than 1 in 10 million. They want your odds of getting cancer from a chemical to be 1 in 10 million or less. And so that's how they set the standard of a lot of allowable concentrations. And so, for example, 1 microgram per liter would increase your cancer risk by 2 times 10 to the minus 7. So that's just an example of the cumulative effect that certain things can have. So, you know, like smoking. Smoking 1 cigarette won't kill you. 2 cigarettes won't kill you. But over the course of 30 years, then a certain percentage of the population is going to develop cancer from smoking. And so that would be an example of a chronic effect. So here is a list, a partial list of the regulated chemicals, and there are so many chemicals that we don't know what the response is. So they've assessed a lot of chemicals. This is just a partial list. You can see A through E. So there's a lot more that's not on this list, but there's an even bigger list of chemicals that we just don't know exactly what is the LD50, and we don't know what is the acute response and the chronic response. So we just have to be suspicious that, you know, none of these things are going to make the water better for us. So that's kind of why I have activated carbon for my drinking water, is that there could be trace concentrations of things that we either aren't looking for or don't know about. And so I think it's good to be cautious when it comes to the water. Microbial contaminants, there's a variety of pathogens that cause diseases like viruses, bacteria, protozoa, worms that can get into you, make you sick. And you can either try and separate the water from the pathogens using something like a membrane, or you can heat the water to inactivate it. And we've talked about disinfection through chemical and physical means and irradiating the water either with UV radiation, or there are some countries where they actually use X-ray to treat food products before it's sold. They don't do that in the United States, but in France, for example, they I don't know if all of the meat gets X-rayed, but that is something that they do, is they use X-ray to kill pathogens in some food products before they're sold. To measure bacteria, there are a variety of methods. You can take a water sample and put it on an agar plate and then look for colonies to form, and then you can guess that every place there's a dot, then there was a bacterial constituent, and then count the number of dots. If you knew the volume of water that was applied, then that would give you an indirect way of assessing the concentration of bacteria. There's another process for testing bacteria that for bacteria that can't grow on an agar plate like this, which is just like a solid nutrient mix. Sometimes they'll take a water sample and put it into a lactose broth, and then they'll put an inverted test tube to capture the gas that's formed when the bacteria are using the lactose. And so, like, if they find gas accumulating in the inverted, upside down, small tube, then that tells them that there's some bacteria at work, and the gas that they collect is an indicator of fermentation. So our book describes what's called the most probable number test. It's just like a statistical analysis technique where you successively take a water sample, dilute it, test for whether you get any gas forming. You dilute the water sample even more, and as you dilute it further and further and further, you can kind of infer the concentration of pathogens in the water based on how many dilutions were required in order to observe no gas from fermentation. We can also use indicator organisms, because we can't always test for every kind of potential pathogen in water, but there are certain indicators that if you find, for example, E. coli in water, then that is a good indicator that it is polluted, because E. coli is relatively strong, and so if it survives, then that tells you that there's not other things that die before E. coli. Like, you wouldn't want to have something you were looking for as an indicator of the water purity, and if it was a very weak bacteria that died easily and there were other kinds of bacteria that didn't die as easily, then it wouldn't be a very effective indicator. So we've selected indicators that we test for just because they're representative of either human or animal contact with the water. They are relatively easy to test for. Coliform bacteria are easy to identify. So it's a pretty common way, for example, of assessing the water quality in Four Pole Creek, is they look for coliform to know like if there is septic tanks that are leaching into Four Pole Creek, if there's animal waste that's running off. It's the indicator organism that if you find it there, there's probably also other disease-causing bacteria that are present. So bacteria can be relatively small. Prokaryotes mean that they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. Protozoa are larger than bacteria, and Giardia is one that we talked about during disinfection, and you can see because of the thicker cell wall that it has, it's relatively resistant to chemical disinfection, but it's relatively sensitive to UV irradiation. Rotifers are pathogentic to humans. Rotifers are useful in wastewater treatment. When we talk about wastewater treatment, really what we want to have in an aeration basin is a wide variety of bacteria and microorganisms. We kind of want like a full ecosystem of some really complicated predator-type microorganisms to have a diversity of species in the wastewater treatment plant and break down the BOD and the cellular material. Yeah, we'll talk more about rotifers when we get to the wastewater treatment part of the course. Nematodes are parasitic worms that are a problem in a lot of the world. People will get parasitic infections that can sap them of their strength, can cause weight loss and dehydration. Sometimes it causes even damage to the feet. You've probably heard about water bears before. Tardigrades are sometimes in the environment. They're not pathogenic to people. Water bears don't cause any kind of health effects, but they're in the environment. We may see them when we're doing water sampling. Hopefully, when we have water that we're using as a source, ideally what we would want is like a high mountain lake. And the higher the elevation, the less likely it is to be polluted, because most industrial processes are at lower altitudes that are closer to large water sources. And so it's kind of a rule of thumb that the higher you go on a mountain, the purer the water is, except for that there still is some airborne air pollution, like global air pollution, mercury, for example, or sulfur dioxide, which turns into sulfuric acid. Those things can still be found at relatively remote, high altitude lakes. The lower in elevation the water is, the more polluted it becomes, just because the waste that's on the ground, like plastic bags and pollution, all flows downhill. And so whether it's the Ganges or the Songhua, the water quality always seems to be the worst at low altitudes. Here's a picture that I took a long time ago when I lived in the United Arab Emirates. We were just out at this really remote, rare freshwater source in the middle of the desert. There are some aquifers there that they actually are artesian wells where the water kind of bubbles to the surface and then flows through these rock formations. But we found like a lawn chair in the middle of that river, so I was kind of surprised. All right, here's where we are going to leave it for today. Unfortunately, we'll have to get to this in-class exercise next time, but we're not finished yet. We still got 3 minutes. This is just going to be the last slide. I want to tell you about the difference between total solids, which is if you have a water sample and you dry it out, either by using like a filter that retains the solids on the filter membrane, or by evaporating it at a relatively low temperature. So this low temperature of 103 Celsius is specifically selected so that it doesn't burn away any kind of volatile compound. You know, if the water has some dissolved leaves in it or other organic material, at 103 it's not going to burn away. So the total solids includes both the fixed solids and the organic solids. But we can differentiate between those which are dissolved and those which are suspended by using a filter. and the dissolved solids would go through the filter. The suspended solids would be retained on the filter. And so total solids could include both suspended and dissolved. Then we can further break down the volatile solids and the fixed solids. If you were going to take a water sample and then put it in an oven at 600 degrees Celsius, then that would burn away anything that has the potential to be combustible. But then things like calcium carbonate, which can be dissolved in water, but calcium carbonate's not going to burn. It's going to evaporate and stay behind after it's burned at a high temperature. And so the fixed solids are you can see here it's talking about the weight of the dish and unburned solids minus the weight of the clean dish. And so these formulas that we'll use in the in-class exercise when we get together on Monday just help us to break down what fraction of the solids in the water are dissolved versus suspended and volatile versus fixed. All right, so that is now all the time that we've got for today. Remember, we're having a quiz on Monday, so please be sure to be here for that one, and have a great weekend.
The quiz will include everything.